Good evening, everyone. Um, Good evening. My name is Fatma Mari, and I am the Deputy Director of the Council for the British Research in the Levant, CBRL, in Amman. And on behalf of the CBRL Director, Dr. Jane Humphreys, who unfortunately is not with us today, and my colleagues at CBRL who are here all around you, around the place. We would like to welcome Your Royal Highness Princess Wajdan Al Hashmi, Your Excellency Mr. Brennan Lynch, Australian Ambassador in Jordan, and our distinguished guests in person and online. And just before we begin this evening, I want to ask you all please to keep your phone silent and to make sure that you fill in your name and address on the attendance sheet. This is especially important for those of you who are here for the first time so that you will receive the CBRL monthly newsletter and announcements about the latest resources and facilities available in the library, as well as information about the activities provided here. And for our online attendees, please write your comments or question in the Q&A box. Turning on to our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. James Fraser, who is well known to most of you, and to those who don't, he is the director of the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in East Jerusalem. He received his PhD from the University of Sydney in 2016, and in 2018, he published his dissertation as the monograph Dolmen in the Levant, which received ASOR's G. Ernest Wright Award for Best Archaeological Publication. Jamie previously served as curator for the Ancient Levant and Anatolia at the British Museum, where he curated the 2023 exhibition Luxury and Power, Persia to Greece. He directs an excavation project in Jordan investigating an early Bronze Age olive oil factory at Khirbet al-Ghozlan, and has archaeological experience in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kashmir, Greece, Cambodia, Australia, and the Solomon Islands. This evening, he will present his latest about his research that was funded by CBRL grant, just he told me, the archaeology of olive oil, excavations of a Bronze Age olive oil factory in the Wadi Rayyam. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Well, look, thank you so much. Can you hear me up the back? Because I'll try and go off microphone. And I was so pleased he could visit us at the site. One, because he's such a friendly guy, and two, because he takes us to so much like that. This is the site of We're up. We're on the Wadi Rayyam, previously known as the Wadi al-Yabis, of course. Sure. Is that good? Lovely, thanks. But we're up in the Rift Escarpment uplands. We're about 390, 400 meters or 370 meters above sea level. So in the middle reaches of this wadi system. And you can see that the site's perched on the top of a hill or a little knoll. So you get the best 360-degree views in anywhere in North Jordan, I reckon. And the site was originally clocked or identified by a survey project called the Survey in the Wadi Yabis by a guy called Gaetano Palumbo, an Italian. And he recognized from the surface pottery that it dates to the early Bronze Age 4. So we're talking, based on our ceramic chronologies, to about 2,500 to 2,000 years BC. But it's a really, really small site. It's only about, well, with occupation, 0.25 of a hectare in size. So this small, tiny, tiny site, which an archaeological survey just on that size alone, if they're coming across that, would go, well, this is a village or maybe a hamlet or even a farmstead. This is so small, but, and this is the kicker, it's got an enclosure wall built around it. And the part where you access the site, where you walk onto that knoll, it's got a double row wall of massive megalithic blocks. Now, I don't think this is an enclosure wall like a city wall to keep out the armies of the pharaoh, but this is a particular wall to control access to that hill that was done sort of 4,500 years ago. Why would they do that? And that's become one of the driving questions. Now, let me put Khirbet al-Ghozlan into its place in time, and then we're going to look at it in its sort of place in space. And in period of time, the period we're looking at, and again, this is based on the pottery, is the early Bronze Age 4. Bear with me. This gets a little tedious, but this is just archaeology. We're very unimaginative. So the bar at the top shows about 2,000 years of history, from 4,000 BC to 2,000 BC. This is, to my mind, one of the most fascinating periods, because what we're seeing is the rise, the flourish, and then the eventual abandonment and collapse of the first cities, the first urban systems in Jordan. So we start with the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, that's in the yellow. Then as people move into sort of more complicated townships, that becomes the early Bronze 1 period. At the very end of the early Bronze 1 period, sort of 3,200, 3,100 BC, you see people agglomerate into sort of nuclei, key sites around the landscape with fortifications around them, palaces, temples, this sort of things. We're talking about the early Bronze 2 and the early Bronze 3. You can see why I mean not imaginative, EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4. But these are the first cities in the region. And then something happens at the end of the EB3 that this urban experiment falls over. Now, you put 4 archaeologists in a room and ask them why, you're going to get 6 opinions and 2 broken legs. But there's a few contenders. Maybe there's incursions from Egypt. Maybe there's shifts in climate. To my mind, and this is all about olive oil, one of the big things is that in the early Bronze 1 period, this springboard from which Jordanian South Levantine urbanism emerges is based on olive oil trade with Egypt. But in the EB2, EB3 period, actually that trade goes away because advances in Egyptian maritime technology mean they start trading instead with Syria, Lebanon, going across to Cyprus, picking up a load of copper, coming back down and kind of cut out the southern Levant altogether. So you've got this system of urbanism built on this international trade that then has it whipped out from under its feet and it kind of collapses and falls in on itself. Either way, that period of collapse, better perhaps described as a period of ruralization, is when these cities are left, ruins in the landscape. This is the early Bronze 4 period. Sometimes it's called the Intermediate Bronze Age, the IBA, but the EB4 This is a period where all those cities are abandoned and people are living in small farming villages once again throughout the landscape. Now, how do we know that these periods and these numbers relate? Well, every time there's a major shift in ceramic styles, the way people decorate, the way they make their pottery, that flags to the archaeologist that we're moving into some sort of different cultural system. And so Chalcolithic, EB1, EB2, EB3, EB4 really are talking to us about a relative chronology. And by that, I mean we recognize them through different looking ceramics. And the numbers we get, the absolute chronology, are by radiocarbon dates that give us fixed points in time. Now, remember this slide. Don't worry, there's no quiz on it, but we are going to come back to it at the very end because, well, there's some strange radiocarbon stuff going on with this site, but I'll keep that for the very end. Anyway, the key point is that the collapse from the EB3 to the EB4 isn't immediate. This isn't the zombie apocalypse where the whole system falls over all in one go. It's kind of staggers over several centuries. And to my mind, I mean, imagine you're in the International Space Station looking down at the southern Levant at night, and then just one by one, very slowly but inexorably, all the lights of the cities turn off till the whole place goes dark. And that's kind of that process over several hundred years. So that's Khirbet Ghozlan in time. It's that period of ruralization. What happens after collapse? What about it in space? And I'll jump through this very quickly. Well, this time period is characterized by hundreds of very small new sites founded in all the different environmental zones throughout the region, but they're all really tiny, small sites, a couple of hectares at most. There's a few sites that continue to be occupied from the previous ones. These are the cities that continue to have a reduced occupation on top of them, and these are medium. And there's really 3, maybe 4 large sites, 20-hectare sites. They're all on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're all at the mouth of the main tributaries rivers. So the Yarmouk, the Zarqa, the Kafrain. So there's something going on with water here. The key point is, in the previous period, sites like Tel el-Hamad, 20 hectares, would have had a whopping great fortification wall around it. That system's gone completely. These are just large villages. But then you get this fourth kind of site, and this is what Khirbet Ghozlan is. It's like the first, a tiny, titchy little scrap of a site in the landscape, and yet it's got some kind of enclosure wall around it. Remember, checking access. And if you dig into it, well, there's half a dozen of these or so that have been found so far in the landscape. They're all newly founded. They're all small. They're all on quite defensible positions. And this is the key. None of them are in the Jordan Valley. None of them are in the coast. They're all on upland areas, the Rift Escarpment of the Jordan Valley. So why on earth would you build an enclosure wall around a really titchy, small site? There's a couple of theories that have been proposed. The excavators at Khirbet Ghozlan say, well, this is like the Acropolis where the elite live that are ruling over a hinterland. You know what? I don't buy that, because why would you have it there in a 20-hectare site down below? And it doesn't work for the other ones. It's a very site-specific explanation. Others have said that hoary old chestnut of the desert and the Son, Bedouin incursions and farming communities. Well, maybe these are farming communities that had to protect themselves from sort of nomadic peoples coming in and stealing their grain. Well, okay, the guy who proposed that is digging at Jebel Rahale. That was Gaetano Palumbo again. And yeah, that is on that cusp zone. But the others, well, Khirbet Ghozlan, Dahrat el-Marah, these are in really fertile areas. It's not on that cusp at all. So again, it's an explanation that doesn't take into account the whole picture. So I had another theory, and my theory was that it's really interesting that these are in the uplands, because the uplands, of course, are the Goldilocks zone for growing olive. Olive doesn't grow well down on the Jordan Valley floor, particularly before the construction of the canals, because of course, the Jordan Valley floor was prone to flooding. And olive trees, as you all know, with their woody roots, rot if they're in areas that are not well drained. But the rift escarpment of the Jordan Valley is perfect precipitation between certain altitudes, perfect drainage. It's why there's olives that are grown there today. I wonder if these small sites are harvesting sites. They're sites that people might not even be living in, but they're coming up to these zones, harvesting their olives in October, November, storing the oil in these central nodes as the harvest continues. So you do need to have someone there to control access, probably, you know, the shab playing on his mobile phone, that's all it takes, but someone just to go, this is ours. And it's like a bank vault in the landscape, one of these most precious commodities stored together while the harvest continues until the harvest is over and the olive oil is distributed throughout the towns and the settlements again. So that is the research hypothesis, if you like. How do we test it? Well, in order to test it, we need to know, well, what are the archaeological signatures of olive oil production? Now here, I'm well aware of the irony of an Australian coming to a Jordanian audience to talk to you about olive production. I mean, it's like a Jordanian coming to the University of Sydney to teach us about kangaroo husbandry. I know that this is silly. You probably know more about it than I do, but we'll go through the very basics. Of course, you would start with harvesting, and everyone's seen how olives are shaken off the tree and raked and all that sort of stuff. The fruit, of course, is then sorted, the twigs, the grubs, the leaves are removed. The fruit is then crushed, the fruit, the stone, everything together. These images are from the mill at Tubna, one of the few in Jordan, if not the only one, I'm not quite sure, still uses the mechanized roller. Tubna is interesting actually because they also dry the olives on the rooftop and then boil them up. So it's a really interesting case study. But the olives are then crushed, and that crushed paste is smeared onto mats, which of course are then exerted through some pressure. There's a Roman period press on the left with kind of weights. This is the vice used at Tubna to press it mechanically. And you can see the olives seeping out of that paste, these kind of golden tears of amazingly wonderful oil. Oh, and while we're still on pressing, what happens to the mats afterwards? Well, all of that stuff that's been pressed, of course, doesn't get thrown away. It gets kept. And anyone know the name in Arabic of that crushed stuff? Jift, absolutely. And of course, the jift has got a lot of uses. It can be turned into briquettes for burning, animal feed, fertilizer. I'm sure there's a whole lot more else. This is a guy at the Tubna mill who's taking it for fuel, for burning. Remember that. Particularly before mechanized production, the juice or the olive oil that was harvested was quite impure, so it would be left for several weeks, and then it would separate water and oil out, so you could decant the oil off and get a purer oil, and then discard the water. So it would be stored and filtered before, of course, you then have your oil. So what are the archaeological signatures? What would you expect to find in the archaeological record? Well, National Geographic always has one of these images, and here we go. I'm sure today I could probably create one on AI. So you've got the certain jars and collecting jars and the rock cut presses and the features and the weights and all of that sort of stuff. What's missing? Anyone know? Absolutely, the people and the olives themselves, the olive pits, but more particularly the crushed olive jift, that stuff from the crushed paste that's then used as a byproduct. That is one of our smoking guns that olive oil pressing has occurred. So that's what we're looking for. Back to Khirbet Ghozlan. So We're up in the Wadi Rayyam, formerly known as the Wadi Yabis, and I've thrown in an image of Jordan's poet Mustafa Wahbi Tal. Why? Anyone? Absolutely. The Ashya Wadi al-Yabis. He was inspired by the beauty of the Wadi al-Yabis, I think, is part of that collection of very famous poems. And it doesn't take much to see why. It is an extraordinarily beautiful place in Jordan. I try and dig in the spring if I can, if for no other reason is you get to just experience it when the wildflowers are out. Honestly, I sometimes just feel like breaking out into song like Julie Andrews. It's a really magic kind of place to be. So back to Khirbet Ghozlan. Now, I was actually working in the Wadi Rayyam for several years on my PhD. I was surveying a ridgeline called the Tel Rus Ridge because I was writing a PhD on dolmens, so early Bronze Age monumental tombs. I won't bore you with those today. But while we were surveying along that ridge, we were recording dolmens, we were recording cairns, but can you see the yellow triangles? Particularly these ones down here. These were presses, olive presses, ones that look like this. They're not big. These aren't Roman sort of large-scale farmstead industrial things. These are small household level presses. We can't date them, but this particular kind, all located within a couple of 100 meters of the Ghozlan Knoll, where Khirbet Ghozlan is. And the way they work is cut into the limestone. There's a basin that's sort of 90 centimeters or so. It slopes slightly on the bottom down to around hole where I assume you could put in some sort of organic funnel or something. The collection tank in here, or more likely probably a jar with a funnel wedged in to collect the oil as it comes off. Now, we don't know that these date to the early Bronze 4. Very likely they date earlier and just kept being used, but they are found very close by. So I'd been surveying along that ridgeline, and we also rediscovered what Gaetano Palumbo had found several years before, the site of Khirbet al-Ghozlan. Now, that's a Google Earth image taken in 2016 on the left. See the olive oil plant grove that had been planted just north of it. Well, that was a new build, and we thought, wow, maybe this site's in danger if the farmer increases his footprint. So when the APAMI, the aerial photography project, Bob Bewley and of course Fraser here at the CBRL, said, we're going to the north, are there any archaeological sites you would like us to take a photograph of from our helicopter? I went, you bet. There's this strange EB4 site with this weird enclosure in the Wadi Rayyam. Could you take an image? And they did. But you could see the farmer had bashed through part of the enclosure, presumably to make way for a new olive grove. The site was in danger. And it's because of this photograph by the APAME project, which is the reason why we went to dig as a rescue excavation. And I took that photograph into the Department of Antiquities and went, this is what's going on. Would really like to do something about it. And I'm very grateful to the APAME project for taking that photograph, and I'm particularly grateful for the Department of Antiquities for letting the project go ahead and for their incredible support. Now, if you stand on that Khirbet Ghozlan Knoll and you look directly west, this is what you see, down the Wadi Rayyam to the Jordan Valley and the hills behind. And if you turn 180 degrees and look due east, this is what you see, straight up the Wadi, up to the plateau, and Ajloon Castle is sort of just behind there on the ridge. It's a stunningly beautiful place to work. It really is. So we've done 3 seasons of excavations, and these excavations were co-sponsored by the British Museum and by the University of Sydney, so a kind of joint UK-Australian project. Season 1, we put a couple of trenches in. To be honest, we didn't even know if we would find anything. We thought there's a lot of bedrock on the surface. We might get in, it'll just be topsoil bedrock, tell us. Well, at least we know. But actually what we found was standing architecture, rooms, surfaces, in situ vessels, and thought, okay, we can come back. That's what we did in 2019, opened up some more trenches, took a few years off like the rest of the world over COVID, turned back up in 2022 and did a final season of excavation then. Now, I'm not going to run through in huge detail all of these various trenches, but one of the big questions was, well, does that enclosure wall actually date to the early Bronze 4 period, this period of collapse? And it does. We can find that quite cleanly on all the strata on each side with the right pottery and all of that sort of thing. What we also notice is that one part of it, you can't see this from a top-down image. These are very flat laid, like a threshold entrance. And you can see there's almost like a kind of ramp coming up to this entranceway, which on the other side just had a very small, well, what looks like an animal corral in it. So this is not big monumental stuff. This is very small scale sort of things. But presumably when people are up there, they're taking a few herds as you would in such a green, well-pastured place. But if you look at the section AB, this is for the archaeologists in the room. This is the standard sequence that we have across the entire site. Bedrock or natural. Occasionally a leveling fill has been brought in to level it up. A very thin lens of occupation. So they've built walls, one floor surface, very thin occupation debris on top, and that's it. Then there's tumble from the walls, and then there's topsoil. This is a site that was briefly occupied and, as I'll argue in a bit, probably seasonally occupied. Just further down from that kind of entranceway, we did get two buildings. You can see one outlined in green here, but both of them are full, the whole site's like this, of these small kind of storage installations. Features that you can't live in there, they're too small, but presumably were for storage. But in the larger kind of courtyard areas, see here and here, again, this would be repeated throughout the site, large grindstones would be laid in, nestled into the bedrock, shaped to fit perfectly, and leveling filled, perfectly brought up so that they've been put in, perfectly lit with the Earth's surface. And then what we found in this building and in this next one were over 30 in situ storage jars, all crushed, and broken, but mendable, all within just these two buildings. So we've called them storage buildings. I'm sure they were doing a lot more than that inside them. But the key point, and again, I'm going to get quite technical, but here is our enclosure wall going along the front. You can see this big, long wall that binds these buildings, and they're built against a line of exposed bedrock. Now, the key thing here is this big, long retaining wall, it's like a terrace wall, abuts the inside face of that enclosure wall. That means that enclosure wall was there first before they built this terrace wall. And then against this terrace wall, all these internal walls are abutting there, which means they've then built this. In other words, this isn't an organic settlement. This is kind of build something from IKEA. They've got it with a plan in mind. They've turned up, they've enclosed the site, they've built that enclosure wall, then they built a retaining wall around a particular kind of area, and then they built the buildings inside. I suspect the whole process wouldn't have taken very long, but it is planned. And that's kind of interesting. And in fact, you can pick up a return of that retaining wall so you can see this storage area is quite defined. And then if we move slightly further south, we get very different sorts of architecture. Same period, but the rooms are much bigger. We've lost that kind of small storage units mostly. And in fact, we get a lot more cooking pots here. We get a couple of hearths. I think this is where people were staying, where they were living when they were using that site. But again, not a lot of occupation stuff. I don't think they're there. We're a very messy species. I don't think they're there for very long, and they're keeping it fairly clean. But but already we can start to see just within this small little area, different parts of different use: domestic, storage, animals. And the key point is that in all of this, it was prepared to be abandoned, or at least prepared to be left in situ. What we're not seeing is a site that's, burnt down or sort of grown out of itself with different remodelings. It's kind of like it's been zapped in from out of space. But what we also found was certain tools, flint knives, rubbing stones, were cached together and placed within these storage bins. The jars are in very particular places. The whole thing's kept fairly clean. I think this is a site, if we do this seasonal argument, that people at the end of the olive harvest, they finished halas for that season, they've packed the site up, they've left it ready to return the next year, and they probably did continue to return for maybe a generation, maybe about 50 years. But for one reason, 1 year, they didn't. And then it was left to slowly collapse in on itself. And that was quite a slow collapse. We can track that until we turned up 4,000 years later. So back to this question of olive oil production. So I've taken you through that site. Well, what are the evidence? Remember those archaeological signatures for olive oil production. What is the archaeology of olive oil? Well, first of all, we don't get much botanical evidence. And archaeobotanical, by which I mean the seeds, the grains, things that get burned and then preserved in the archaeological record. These are archaeological gold. Well, we don't get very much at all because there's not a lot of occupation debris there. It's a very clean site. But what we do get is compelling. So in every single good context of early Bronze 4, we would take a lot of soil, usually 20 litres at least if we could, bag it up, and it eventually gets taken to a flotation machine, floated, and then all the organic remains come and float up the top and they get captured. And then eventually we would send these to the British Museum. And in addition to those ones, we were also taking lumps of charcoal. Whenever we found charred wood, charcoal within the trenches, stop very carefully without touching it into our foil, packaged up, and then sent to these scientific labs at the British Museum. We sent them there because my colleague, Dr. Caroline Cartwright, who is the senior research scientist and a leading archaeobotanist, has an SEM lab at the BM. So SEM, scanning electron microscopy. This is where the CBRL comes in, because we had all these samples carefully, lovingly collected, labeled, packaged, exported, and sent, but we didn't have the funding for the British Museum to do the analysis. And that's when I applied to the CBRL, and they went, "We like the smell of this project, let's make it happen." So everything I'm talking about in these next few slides are entirely due to CBRL support. So the first thing Caroline did was look at all that charcoal under the scanning electron microscope. She does that from 3 different angles, from 3 different planes. The reason is all plant species, just like an animal species, their skeletons look different if it's an animal. The way the sort of the cellular structure is different for archaeobotanics as well. So Caroline can identify the species. In other words, what wood are they burning? This is the wood that they're burning. They're burning olive wood. Well, that's great, I said to Caroline. Fantastic. That's what I was kind of hoping to hear. And Caroline went, "No, you idiot, listen. They're only burning olive wood. I've never seen this in an archaeological assemblage before. What we would expect would be wild species, all sorts of different things burning that couldn't get muddled up together in a kind of messy village community. This is entirely olive wood." I'll come back to that significance in just a second. She also found through those flotation residues, the really small ones, they're also burning wood that is really green, really young, sort of saplings and shoots of saplings. Wood you wouldn't normally collect to burn, but that's being gathered up and being burned as well. Again, olive wood, these young shoots perhaps that you would prune off your trees as part of orchard maintenance. And then from all the microscopic stuff, we're getting stuff. Now, I think this is a really beautiful image. And I know a mother would only love this one. But what you're looking at is gift. This is what a crushed olive seed looks like under the microscope. And we had gift in every single sample. And remember, that's the smoking gun for olive pressing. It's there. But it's there, it's preserved because it's been burned. In other words, they've been using it as fuel, just as people do today. Now, there were a few other species. There's a little bit of fig. There's more ziziphus, actually, and ziziphus grows wild in the area even today. There was a couple of grains of barley. I think there's 1 grain of wheat, and that's it. Overwhelmingly, like 96% or something, the organic remains are olive. And that is a highly unusual signature. And you don't just have to take my word for it. So here we are up in the eastern escarpment. Khirbet Ghozlan, down in the Jordan Valley, there's a site called Tel Abu Niyaj. Tel Abu Niyaj was dug by the University of Arizona, and they did a fantastic publication where they went into all the archaeobotanical remains. Now, Tel Abu Niyaj is the same period. It's ceramics, the early Bronze Fall, this same period of collapse. But it's a bog standard agro-herding village that you would expect. So this is the column we want to look at. So remember that I said only olive wood was found? Well, we can compare one that's about 8 kilometers away to another village. And sure, half of what they're burning are orchard taxa, in this case, fig. Remember, olive doesn't grow very well down in the Jordan Valley floor. Fig does. But half of it is other stuff, shrubs, trees, wild things that sort of get mixed up as well. So it's really a very different signature. And it matters that almost no charred seeds were found as well. Because, again, looking at this contemporary site, well, there's a few from their orchard taxa. Again, we're talking fig. But there's cereals, there's pulses. It's what you would expect from people in a farming village occupied all the time. Wheat, barley, pomegranate, grape, lentils, chickpeas. And wild taxa, meaning wild grasses. This is probably stuff that their flocks have eaten, their herds. And the dung, of course, is kept, dried, and burned as fuel. So if we think about how these things get into the archaeological record, what we're seeing is a community that for some reason is stockpiling olive wood, and then they're burning that. And the best explanation for that is if you're simply maintaining your orchards, maintaining your trees. And why go out and get a whole bunch of other wood? Why go out and burn animal dung if you've got this stockpile of wood anyway? So I think that's the signature that we're seeing. Just to look at some of the other objects, beautiful flint knives. These are called Canaanian blades. Very often, such as at Niyaj, you get them in segments where they're hafted and used as sickles for harvesting wheat. Not these ones. They're not segmented like that. In fact, if you look at where some of the notching is consistently on some of these, I wonder if they've been hafted, if they've been tied to use as a tool. I wonder if we're looking at our ancient pruning saws. Now, I don't know, and I'm no lithicist, but our lithicist in Italy is currently looking at these under the microscope for use wear to see if we can get any more of a handle on that. Now, the pottery, remember I talked to you about all those jars in situ? The pottery is overwhelmingly, again, sort of 75, 80% storage, which means storage jars. Tall, narrow neck jars like this, open jars like this, sometimes with pot lids. But again, you would normally expect cooking pots and bowls and jugs and drinking cups and all this sort of stuff. That's all there, but the ratios are different. It's not almost all, but it's overwhelmingly storage. And there are vessels like this as well. They're often described as teapots. They're about this big, with the spout off the top. But if you're holding something like that and it's full of liquid, that's kind of really hard to pour. I don't think these are teapots. I think these are decanting vats. I think these are the vessels where you put that oil in, you wait for it to separate, and then after a few weeks, you can pour the oil out the top or pour water in, the oil decants off the top, and you get a purer, higher quality product. And this is what some of the other pots look like. These envelope handles crossed over like that, are our classic tell for the early Bronze 4 period. Now, you don't have to take my word that these are all oil jars, because we brought over Lisa Briggs, Lisa from the British Museum, who's an expert in lipid residue analysis, and she sampled several of these jars, the vats, the jars, and she looked at all the compounds that were still trapped within the walls of these vessels, and she ended up saying, well, you know what's there? The degraded proteins that you would expect from vegetable fats. Well, olive oil is the most common vegetable fat. I said, brilliant, Lisa. Does this mean it was olive oil? And she went, no, it means it's the degraded protein of vegetable fats, because she's a scientist and very proper. But I reckon that's as good as we're ever going to get, that that's what they're storing inside. Animal bones, there's not many. I'm putting this slide up because a colleague, zooarchaeologist from UCL, might be listening. There's not many. In fact, this is pretty much it for the diagnostic bones that we've got. If I was digging an occupied normal tell site, I'd expect to find this amount before breakfast. This is 3 seasons of digging. Essentially, it's sheep, goat, and they're hunting a little few bits of other things, birds, things like that. But there's parts from the whole animal. So they're bringing up sheep, goat, probably pasturing them, and of course, killing and using them for food as well. So our signatures for olive oil pressing, what have we got? Harvesting. Well, we've got good evidence for that, I think. The burned olive orchard prunings. And not only that, the burned shoots as well. We've got evidence for crushing, the burned jift. We've even got grinders that I think were used for that. They're certainly not using it for wheat. There isn't any wheat there. We've got evidence for pressing with the rock cut presses nearby, evidence for filtering with those decanting vats, evidence for storage with the jars, plus the chemical compounds we're in. And I reckon as archaeology goes, that's a pretty compelling case for what the archaeology of olive oil production looks like in the early Bronze 4 period. The absence of evidence is really telling here too. Now, we always have to be careful in archaeology. The absence of evidence isn't always strong. Maybe you just haven't found it yet. But we're dealing with a site that with single surfaces. This isn't a site that people are living and making a lot of mess. It's very discreetly used for a very short period. Very little ash, there's few animal bones. The archaeobotanic is very restricted. There's no modifications in the architecture. It's a very finely defined site. So what do we make of all this? Well, I think the best explanation is that we're dealing with a seasonal olive oil production site. And there's a very famous stela from Tel Gezer, 10th century, so, you know, significantly after this period in sort of Proto-Semitic script. But it's wonderful because it gives us the rhythms, the cadence for rural life, at least in the 10th century. And it's really not any different to today, where 2 months you spend gathering your olives, 2 months you go back and prune and maintain your orchard. And I think that's what we're dealing with. And there's a really great analogy, and it's, of course, it's the olive oil factories, the Mazra'at today. This one is at Kufrabil. So it's about 2 kilometers away from Khirbet Ghozlan in the same area. And for most of the year, it looks like this. The doors are locked, the lights are off, machinery is under plaster. That's how it would look like right now. Become the middle of October, give or take, the first summer rains have washed the fruit, the lights are switched on, the doors are unlocked, and it becomes one of the most dynamic places in Jordan, as all the farmers from the region bring their olives together at the same time, because they're all harvesting at the same time, and they're working through the night, and it's really busy doing what they need to do until the harvest is over it's locked up again and left alone. And I think that's exactly what we're looking at for Khirbet al-Ghozlan, just 4,000 years earlier. Well, 4,000 years earlier, this is where I'm going to take us on a bit of a U-turn. Because I'm going to give you a little bit of new data that has come out of this. And again, it comes out of the archaeobotany. So when we send all those archaeobotany results to the British Museum and Caroline looks at them under the scanning electron microscope and she identifies the species and all of that, that's fabulous. But it also means that Caroline can choose the best samples that we then send for radiocarbon dating. We did this at the end of the project because there wasn't much to do, wasn't much archaeobotanics, so Caroline wanted to see the full thing to pick the best samples. And that's what we did. We sent them to Scotland, a lab called CERC in Scotland, and it's a beautiful set of numbers. Now, I'm sorry, there's a lot of graphs and numbers here. Let me just try and de-archaeologicalize it, I guess. What we're seeing, these are the dates of each of these individual samples. Each of these is a bit of olive wood charcoal or seed. These are the date ranges that the lab says that that could date to. So radiocarbon dating, something dies, there's carbon isotopes that degrade over time on a certain rate. So if you measure how much of that isotope is left, you can then date when that thing died. So it can't do it to pottery, wasn't alive. Can do it to bits of wood. The wonderful thing is they all cluster, these 12 samples, pretty tightly, all within about 50 years. That's exactly what we thought the site was being used in this really finite envelope. What I wanted to know was that where in this early Bronze 4 period, this period of collapse, this sort of 400, 500, 600 year period, where do we put that discrete slice? Are we looking at the last gasp of early Bronze 3 urbanism, or are we looking at the very beginning of the springboard back into the Middle Bronze Age? I didn't know. They've all come back around about 2900 BC. That's 400 years too early. It doesn't match. The pottery that we've got says it's early Bronze 4. It must be at earliest 25. To have these clustering at 29, that just doesn't gel. And I presented this at a conference in Lyon a few weeks ago, and I've got to say, all the archaeologists in the room immediately shifted and looked uncomfortable when I showed them this, because it doesn't look right. So how do we explain it? Oh, the significance. Now, remember I said there's two different ways of dating. You've got the ceramics dating and the radiocarbon. So the ceramics for Khirbet Ghozlan date to the EB4, clean. It's a great group of unmissable ceramics from this period. But the radiocarbon dates are pulling us all the way back to the transition between EB2 and EB3, the urban zenith, if you like. And it doesn't kind of work. We have a mismatch, an old archaeological problem between relative dating and absolute dating. And how do we resolve it? Well, first up, I've got to say, I thought, okay, we've got our dates wrong. Maybe there's an earlier site underneath that we've somehow missed and we've just dug through and sampled it. Now, I don't think that holds. I mean, we've got 12 samples that all back each other up. I can't believe we missed all the EB4 ones and got all the ones from an earlier site that all happen to be the same. But more than that, where we did take samples, it's from inside crushed vessels that are the standard early Bronze 4 jars. It's from inside the storage bins in which really good early Bronze 4 materials are found. They're from very clean surfaces of rooms going up to walls with foundation trenches. It doesn't hold that there's an earlier site. This beautiful set of dates comes from the site we excavated. I don't buy that we've missed something. Did we get the pottery wrong? I mean, it's happened before. For that, Gaetano Palumbo would have got the surface pottery wrong, and he's Mr. EB4. Now, ceramicist is an Italian Dr. or Professor Marta D'Andrea, who's also an expert in the EB4, and I believe what they say, that actually the pottery all hangs together. It's a good, clean, tight group of what early bronze fort pottery should look like. And I've shown you a lot of the storage jars. There's some fine wares. Now, early bronze fort pottery is not pretty. I do know that. It's really basic, sandy, ugly stuff. But what you kind of see on these ones, the bowls, bands red and trickles coming down, where the paints trickle down. It's a particular kind of fine ware called trickle painted ware. It's a hallmark of this period, and it's there on the side, often in the same context as the radiocarbon samples. Is it then an old wood problem? And by that I mean, when you're dating something from the time it died, not necessarily from the time that it got into the archaeological record. So, for example, if you're building a house and you've used a beam of oak wood that had been cut down a few hundred years before, you've recycled it out of an earlier house, you've put it in your house, if you dated that wood, it would make your house 200-300 years earlier than it actually is. An old wood problem. Now, we've dated a lot of charcoal from large samples, from what they're burning, these orchard prunings, because that's what we had. I don't think it's an old wood problem because they still are beautifully clustered together. And I don't buy that people have cut down these olive trees, stockpiled the wood that somehow survived as cut down wood for 400 or 500 years before it's all burnt together in the same event. But we don't have to even buy that because we've also done it off short life samples, samples that presumably got burned in the same kind of year or so that they died. Things like weeds, the olive pits, barley, that sort of stuff. And it all matches each other. And if you look at the shapes of the curves, they all replicate each other. And that replication underscores that these are a really robust set of data. Well, some of the people at this last conference said maybe the lab got it wrong. You've got 12 dates, but maybe they just forgot to carry the one, didn't work it out properly. And at that last conference, I said, well, maybe that is a possibility because we'd sent another 6 samples to a different lab, this time to Oxford, but I didn't have the results back. So I'm going to show you, is the first time I've talked about these. We got them back and bingo, they're even tighter than before. So for all the archaeologists in the room, we've now got 18 radiocarbon dates sampled from across the site, from long life, from short life, from different species, and they all back each other up. And they all say that this site dates to just before about 2900 BC to about 2850 BC, give or take. So if we haven't got the science wrong, we must have the archaeology wrong. Back to that slide. Now, remember I said we define this by ceramics. The ceramics change, we get into our new period, all of that sort of thing. What I think we're dealing with here are different trajectories. I think we think a bit too black and white in archaeology. It's the EB1, okay, we hit 3100, we're now into the EB2, everyone changed the pots you're using. A few hundred years later, the memo goes out, we're in the EB3, time to use Khirbet ware. A few hundred years later, okay, boys, we've all collapsed, we're now in the EB4, throw out your kitchenware, we're using something else. It's not as clean as that. That actually, these transitions are pretty messy. And in fact, if you look at, now remember I said the EB2, EB3, those cities that then collapse. If you look at when they collapse, they don't all collapse at the same time. And in fact, the 2 largest, closest to Ghozlan, Pella and Tel Sarvia, both of which collapse at the end of the early Bronze II, 2900. And I wonder, have we got, not across the whole region, but in this part of the North Jordan Valley, particularly on the east, somewhere where the EB3 never happens, We know what the EB3 looks like, these massive cities, because we dig the really large sites. There's very few rural EB3 period sites dug. So instead of asking, how can we have an EB4 site in EB3? Let me put the question differently. What does EB3 rural look like? I think in this part of the Jordan Valley, which is very discrete, it looks like the EB4. I think we need to drag this period all the way up. It doesn't make this wrong, but we've got different trajectories. We've got cities continuing while we've got people sliding into that ruralism hundreds of years earlier than we thought they were. And that makes archaeologists uncomfortable because it means our big way, our big sort of anchor points for looking at the past are a lot more shifty than we thought they were. And that's pretty profound. And that's, in a way, a kind of a dangerous idea. But I think we've got the data to back this up. So I will end it there. Just to say, why does this all matter? Well, first of all, that whole thing about olive oil, you cannot understand the development of civilizations and complex societies here in Jordan without understanding the role of olive oil. Fundamental to how these cities develop by trading oil with Egypt, how these cities get abandoned when the oil trade disappears, and how people were resilient, how they kept going in the landscape by still doing everything they did before, just in slightly reconfigured ways. But also what we're seeing are different trajectories, different stories where our urban story and our village rural story can be completely different. And I don't think we've really got our head around that yet as archaeologists. And finally, the role of small sites is really significant here. Now, Khirbet Ghozlan, it's sort of 100 meters from north to south, 50 meters east to west. You could drop that in the footprint of the Roman amphitheatre here in Amman and still have room for a coffee shop. It's really small. But these small sites have a big role to play. Maybe they can even start taking an axe to some of our periodization if they're asked interesting questions with good, robust scientific methodology in new ways. And that, I think, is why this matters. It's giving us a different perspective. And for that, I particularly thank the CBRL, because without that scientific backing, we would never have got this perspective at all. So thank you.